Sheinelle Jones believed she had already lived through the worst day of her life until the moment her husband Utch collapsed in front of their children. It was a calm Sunday morning. The kids were in the living room watching cartoons while she was in the kitchen preparing breakfast. Utch entered the room, gave her that familiar smile he always did, and then, out of nowhere, his body trembled, his knees gave out, and he dropped just for a second. Sheinelle didn't move. She assumed he may have just slipped. But when she called out his name and got no reply, a surge of panic hit her like a crashing wave. Paramedics arrived swiftly, but by the time they reached the hospital, he was already gone. The doctors explained it was a silent heart condition, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a rare and often undetected disease. It had been growing silently inside him for years, but the most devastating part, Utch had known. He'd been keeping it to himself, keeping it from everyone, even from Sheinelle. The funeral took place a week later. People came from everywhere, friends, family, neighbors. They cried as they shared memories, speaking about Utch's kindness and how he always put others before himself. Still, something felt off to Sheinelle. It wasn't only the overwhelming grief, it was also the way certain people looked at her, with eyes that seemed as if they wanted to say something, but held it back. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself she was just reading too much into things. But deep down, something didn't sit right. After the funeral, when she and her children returned home, the quiet inside the house was deafening.
Every inch of the place reminded her of him. His shoes still by the door, his favorite book resting on the table, the scent of him lingering in the sheets. She clung to every memory. That night, after the children were asleep, she walked into their bedroom, opened his drawer, and started sifting through his things. Old receipts, a set of car keys, a broken watch, and then she found it. A sealed envelope, her name written on it in Uche's handwriting. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. The letter was dated 6 months before he passed, but it wasn't a farewell note, not in the usual sense. It was something else entirely. He wrote about how deeply he loved her, how much she had transformed his life, how she had stood by him in ways no one else ever had. But partway through, the tone shifted. He wrote that if she was reading this letter, it meant he was no longer here, and he asked her not to be angry. Not because of the illness, but for the secrets he could never bring himself to reveal. One sentence burned into her mind. "Please forgive me if something comes out after I'm gone. Just know," he said, "that everything he did to protect her." Sheinelle froze. What did he mean? What secret? Why was he asking to be forgiven? She read the letter over and over again, searching for clarity, but there were no answers, just those haunting words. At first, she assumed he might have been referring to the illness. Maybe he had meant hiding. Maybe that was the secret. But the way he had written it, it didn't feel that simple. It felt like there was something more beneath the surface. Something deeper, something unspoken. Days went by, but the letter stayed with her, sitting heavy on her mind. She told no one. She kept it to herself. But then, small strange things began to happen. A week after the funeral, a bouquet of flowers arrived. Tucked inside was a card. The message on it was brief. He was more than what you knew. There was no name, no number, nothing to trace it back. That's when the fear began creeping in. That night, Sheinelle couldn't sleep. The letter from Uche and the strange card played in her head like a horror film stuck on repeat. She stared up at the ceiling, her mind spinning, trying to decipher those haunting words. He was more than what you knew. What hadn't she known about the man she'd spent 10 years of her life loving? By morning, she had made a decision, one she never imagined herself making. She went to find Uche's old phone, the one that had been sitting untouched in a drawer since he passed. It was locked, of course, but Sheinelle remembered the password, his birthday. It unlocked instantly. Her hands were slick with sweat as she scrolled through messages and photos, searching for comfort, clarity, maybe even hoping to prove to herself that this was just her grief playing cruel tricks on her. But what she discovered made her chest tighten. Dozens of text messages. Not from one woman, but 3. All of them were saved under misleading names. One was listed as Electric Company, another as Book Club, and the third as Mr. James. But when she opened the threads, the truth hit her hard. These weren't utility messages. They were personal, intimate, emotional. In one, a woman had written, "I miss your arms around me. You said you were going to leave her. Why didn't you?" Another message said, "Don't let her find out. You promised." Sheinelle stared at the screen, tears falling silently down her cheeks. Her hands trembled. Her head was spinning. She had loved this man completely. She had trusted him with everything. And now, after his death, she was uncovering a life he had kept hidden. A second life. Maybe even a third. But it didn't stop there. She tried calling the numbers. One was disconnected. The second rang once, then went to voicemail. But the third number picked up. A woman answered. Her voice was gentle, but carried a distant chill. Sheinelle was at a loss for words. All she could manage was a question. How did you know Uche? There was a pause. Then the woman replied, You must be Sheinelle. That single sentence hit Sheinelle like a punch to the stomach. The woman went on, He told me about you. He said he couldn't leave you, not because he didn't love me, but because he said you wouldn't survive it. Sheinelle ended the call without another word. Her heart was pounding. Her thoughts were chaos. So it was true. This wasn't just harmless flirting. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't a mistake. Uche had been unfaithful. For how long, she had no idea. But it felt as though everything they had shared had suddenly crumbled into nothing. For days, she shut herself away inside the house. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep. She barely spoke a word to the kids. Her eyes kept drifting to the photos on the wall. Wedding pictures, birthdays, family trips. And all she could think was any of it real? Was I the only one living honestly while he lived a lie? Then, something even more devastating happened. 1 week later, Sheinelle received another letter in the mail. But this one wasn't from Uche. It was from a lawyer's office. At first, she assumed it had something to do with his life insurance, or maybe some paperwork connected to his death. But when she opened it, her throat went dry. It was a legal claim. A woman named Desiree had filed for a share of Uche's estate. The letter stated she was doing so on behalf of her son, Uche's son, a son Sheinelle had never even heard of. She sat there, completely frozen, staring down at the paper in her hands. The name Desiree meant nothing to her, but what hit her hardest was that one line, on behalf of her son, Uche's son. How could that even be? They had 3 children together. Sheinelle had always believed she knew every corner of his life, but this was something she couldn't have imagined in her worst dreams.
Without thinking twice, she drove straight to the law office listed in the letter. She needed answers, real ones, not just cryptic texts and emotional goodbyes. When she arrived and gave her name, the receptionist glanced up and said they'd been expecting her. This way, the woman said, guiding Sheinelle into a quiet, softly lit room. Inside was an older man with weary eyes, Desiree's attorney. He greeted Sheinelle politely, then slid a folder across the table toward her. Miss Desiree Williams has chosen to come forward now. After Mr. Uche's passing, he began, his voice calm but emotionally removed. She's making a claim that her son, Micah, is the biological child of Mr. Uche. Sheinelle felt her head begin to spin. That couldn't be true. It just couldn't. She whispered the words more to herself than to him. The lawyer gave a slow nod, as if he had anticipated that exact reaction.